hold Michigan State in a high regard because the majority of my beginnings watching college football was watching guys like Mark Dantonio be one of the most consistent coaches in all of college football. And then even predating that, you also have Nick Saban as well. And it's disappointing seeing the state of Spartan football right now. And I get why they went after Jonathan Smith. He was successful at Oregon State, and I think a lot of people were kind of concerned with his ability to recruit, within the Midwest, and obviously that was pretty accurate. And I think a lot of people can kind of agree that the writing was on the wall there. And in comes in Pat Fitzgerald, and I have to tell you, the energy in the atmosphere, and from every beat writer that I've talked to who covers the Spartans, is absolutely electrified in terms of Pat Fitzgerald and the staff, and who they could possibly go after in the transfer portal. I mean, just absolutely night and day. Because if you think about 2 years ago, before they brought in Jonathan Smith, I mean, you think of the uh, turbulent time with Mel Tucker, and it was just announced a couple weeks before the transition of Jonathan Smith to Pat Fitzgerald that the NCAA was going to be putting Michigan State on a 3-year probation due to playing some ineligible players. Now, I think we can kind of debate back and forth in terms of whether the merits of vacating wins, so to speak, actually really matter. But I think what's really most importantly going to be penalized for the Spartans, and I think that's going to be a more significant challenge for Pat Fitzgerald and the staff, is they're going to face some restrictions according to the NCAA. They're going to face restrictions on official and unofficial visits, recruiting communications, recruiting person days, and a little bit of off-campus recruiting contacts and evaluations over that probationary period as well. Now, I believe during the probationary period, they can still make bowl games. It doesn't seem like that they're necessarily taking away scholarships, because this is because of Mel Tucker. So, I think you kind of have to find that balance between the two. But most importantly, I think what this says more than anything is that you get penalized for actually participating in the NCAA's investigations. Because, for example, Michigan State complies, and then you have other bigger schools like the Tennessees of the world who decide to sue the NCAA, and nothing happens to them. But in any event, it's just a good little context to have when talking about Michigan State. But I have to tell you, I love the Pat Fitzgerald hire, and anybody that's telling you otherwise is probably people who don't know shit about the Big Ten. I've I've covered the Big Ten. I followed the Big Ten. My first love was Penn State, so I understand how consistent Michigan State is. I understand how great of a fan base that they have, and I think anyone in the Big Ten can respect and admire just how consistent the Spartans are. And I think they're in a really good place to finally be getting back to that consistent kind of threshold that I think a lot of people at Michigan State are kind of longing for. And it was just announced the other day that Greg and Dawn Williams donated $400 million to Michigan State. Now, a certain percentage of that's going to be going to the football team and the athletics and everything. But I believe it's $290 million that's going towards the athletic departments, and they're trying to raise, I think, $1 billion was the number that I heard. So between the $400 million donation, between Pat Fitzgerald being hired, you have your new athletic director, Jay Batt, in there too. I mean, you got to be freaking excited about what's going on here. Now, I don't want to also short sell as well how difficult this could be for the first little bit, right? Because even going into the season, Michigan State was a relatively young team. And, I think there was a lot of excitement around Adrian Chiles. And, he's a solid quarterback. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot of people saw his upside. I think a lot of people know they had a cannon of an arm. But unfortunately, just those mechanics and being kind of a turnover machine was ultimately the reason why they went with Miliosevic. And from the reports that I read today, he's supposed to come back for another season. And I think if you're Pat Fitzgerald, to have a redshirt sophomore in there who understands the system, and somebody who I think can make a legitimate case to be the starter for next season. I think that has to be exciting, even though you're probably going to be in the position for a transfer quarterback, possibly. I mean, because, at least for me, in sort of the past 5 seasons, the most successful quarterback that you've had was probably Peyton Thorne back in 2021. So I think there is going to be some difficulties there, but I think what you really like about Miljosevic more than anything is that he gets through his reads relatively proactively. He has a really strong pocket presence. He understands when he needs to run and use his feet versus when he needs to trust his offensive line, which was relatively minimal last year. But most importantly, what he can do is he's willing to take the pressure within the pocket and deliver the throws that he needs to. He's not afraid of contact. And I think if you're a quarterback, that's something that you have to love to see. And I think no matter what kind of happens in this offseason, I think a lot of Michigan State fans would be really excited to, at the very least, have him on the roster. But if you're looking at this Michigan State team and you kind of ask yourself, what needs to happen in order to improve as quickly as possible and be able to get them kind of in the right direction going into this 2026 season? I mean, there's a couple different things you can kind of look at here. I'll talk a little bit about the recruiting class, and then we'll go into a couple key positions that I think they should be heading into in terms of the transfer portal. Now, what's fascinating about this recruiting class, it's pretty much exactly mirroring Jonathan Smith's recruiting class of last season, in the sense that they went from 14th to 12th in terms of the Big Ten overall. But in turn, I always use On3 Sports when I talk about recruiting on this channel. But they were 47th last year, 46th this year, only 25% in state. Now, I think that's relatively reasonable given that you're competing against the Ohio States of the world. You're competing against the Michigans of the world, the Iowas and the Nebraskas. So I think that could make sense. But I think most importantly, what actually kind of drew my attention was the fact that they got 20 commits. And I think that's a testament to Pat Fitzgerald, and I think it's a testament to some of the effort that Jonathan Smith and his staff have been putting in. And obviously Cole Moore, who's the director of player personnel, all those guys deserve a ton of credit for really putting together a pretty solid recruiting class for a team that is rebuilding, and I think a team that I think a lot of people have some questions about. Now, it's led by a couple guys here. We got Colin Campbell, Kai Kaufman, and Samson Gash as well. So there's a couple different guys here who I think are going to be pretty significant. Now, I think Kai Kaufman, I don't think he's going to be competing for the starting job necessarily, but he's a 4-star kid, and number 5 in the state, and somebody that at the very least is going to be a depth guy and somebody who can at least learn behind Miljosevic and possibly be his backup, depending on what they decide to do in terms of the transfer portal. So you have to be at least excited about what you're seeing from there too, because the thing is, if you're Michigan State, like, here's what you have going for you. You have a pretty quality recruiting class, all things considered. He's had the last 2 years to be able to kind of map out what his plan's going to be able to know specifically what he wants to do in the transfer portal, and to kind of see where this roster takes shape a little bit. Because I think what I'm excited to see, as a huge Pat Fitzgerald fan, I would argue it's the best hire of the entire recruiting cycle. I'll go as far to say that. But what I'm really excited to see is how Pat Fitzgerald is going to recruit without the limitations of having to focus on the rigorous academic standards that Northwestern has. And I think that's where you're going to be able to kind of focus on getting the cream of the crop, the best of the best that you possibly can within the state of Michigan and the surrounding states, and being able to develop those 3-star to slightly 4-star kids, to be able to develop them into some all Big Ten caliber players, just like he did at Northwestern. I think if you're a Michigan State fan, the prospect of that has to be exciting. And I get that a lot of people like to talk about the part of his last couple years in Northwestern, and I get that, but I think that is a relative anomaly. And I would also argue that there's a number of head coaches that, if you've been there 15, 20 years, you're going to have a bad season or two. Unfortunately, it just so happened to coincide with the hazing scandal, which they concluded that he didn't know anything about. But lastly, to kind of wrap up this video, in terms of where they're going to go in terms of the transfer portal, I think there's going to be a couple big needs if you ask me. I'd say first and foremost, this offensive line has to be cleaned up. I know a lot of people gave uh, Adrian Chili's a lot of shit, and I know Milio Sovic is a younger kid, but this all starts from within. And the Spartans' offensive line was really a huge problem for him, and I think a large part of why they really had a lot of inconsistencies in terms of the offense side of the ball. They gave up 37 sacks this year, which is the only other team that gave up more was Rutgers. So to be in the same kind of filler compared to Rutgers definitely isn't very strong either. And you're also going to, assuming that you get to keep Stan and Ramel and Connor Moore. I don't know whether they're going to enter the portal. If you do have an announcement on that, please put that in the comments so I'm aware. But you're going to have to definitely get some guys in the portal who can kind of come in immediately and be at least a little bit of an upgrade. So I anticipate them definitely looking at guys in the MAC conference, for example, who can possibly do that and be a little bit of an upgrade. And also, you lose starting setter Matt Golban as well, who is out of eligibility and graduating. But I'd say the other two real quick. Wide receiver obviously is going to be a big deal. They're just in the sense that, okay, can we at least get one guy in there who can get some extra attention so it's a couple other guys can maybe be more creative and saying, hey, you know what, we're going to bring the secondary on some more blitzes. We're going to be a lot more aggressive in terms of the linebacker room. But the good news is anybody that watched Northwestern football knows that any Pat Fitzgerald coach team is disciplined, they're physical, and they're going to be really exciting to watch. Let me know in the comments what you think of Michigan State and their transformation over the past month. I'm really excited to see what they're going to do in the transfer portal, and I will not be shocked at all when you inevitably see Pat Fitzgerald be successful here.